January 1986, Worcester, Massachusetts. One freezing Tuesday morning, 850 workers walk into the massive Park Avenue factory, punch their time cards, and are abruptly told they will not be walking back in. There was no Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing to warn them. There was no court order. There was no town hall meeting. The doors simply close. A legendary American firearms factory that had operated without a single day of interruption since 1874 goes cold in a matter of hours. The company that just died on that winter morning had produced more than 25 million firearms across 113 years of American history. It had armed American soldiers in 2 world wars. It had earned a prestigious War Department commendation for manufacturing excellence. It had survived the brutal economic winter of the Great Depression, the supply chain chaos of the Korean War, and the massive legislative earthquake of the Gun Control Act of 1968. Yet, it did not survive a random Tuesday in 1986. The real story of Harrington and Richardson is not just the closure itself. It is a much deeper story. It is the story of what 113 years of deliberate, stubborn restraint, of consciously choosing the affordable over the ambitious, the reliable over the remarkable, does to a company when the world suddenly stops rewarding that specific choice. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of extreme competence in a dying market segment. Every week on this channel, we tell the unvarnished stories of the brilliant engineers, the massive factories, and the quiet corporate decisions that built, or quietly destroyed, the world's most important firearms brands. If that deep industrial history matters to you, make sure you watch until the end, because the lesson of H&R applies to almost every industry today. The story begins in Worcester, Massachusetts, in 1871. At the time, Worcester was not Hartford. It was not New Haven. It was not the famous Connecticut Gun Valley that had given America household names like Colt, Winchester, and the Springfield Armory. But Worcester had quietly built itself into the most densely mechanized mid-sized city in the entire state of Massachusetts. The machinists who worked those hundreds of small shops had been meticulously trained on tight tolerances. And that mechanical discipline was exactly what mass firearms manufacturing required. Worcester had the workforce. Into this humming industrial city came Gilbert H. Harrington. He was, fundamentally, a mechanic operating lathes and milling cutters. He came to firearms through the machine, not through the gun. William A. Richardson was the other half of this critical equation. He came up through the hardware trade. He understood exactly what a rural farmer, a shopkeeper, or a traveling salesman would pay for a functional revolver, and more importantly, what they absolutely would not pay. Where Harrington saw mechanisms and tolerances, Richardson saw ledgers and markets. They formalized their partnership in 1871 with a modest starting capital of around $500. Their very first product was a single-action revolver chambered in .32 rimfire. They weren't trying to introduce a groundbreaking new technology. They were doing something much more dangerous to their competitors. They were introducing a new price point. Colt's premium revolvers in 1871 sold for anywhere from $15 to $25. At the other end of the market, cheap Belgian and German pocket revolvers sold for $3 to $6, but they were notoriously poorly built with wide, dangerous cylinder gaps. Harrington and Richardson aimed to close that engineering gap. They aggressively applied the American system of manufacturing, machining components to such precise tolerances that any part could be assembled without expensive hand fitting. And they did it at a revolutionary price point, just $8. What do you think is a better long-term business strategy in the firearms industry? Building expensive, premium weapons with high margins like Colt, or dominating the affordable volume market like H&R? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. By 1874, the strategy was working so well that H&R constructed a massive, purpose-built manufacturing facility on Park Avenue in Worcester. They began producing the top-break revolver, which would become their signature platform. A conventional revolver of the era required loading one chamber at a time, a slow and cumbersome process. But with the top-break action, releasing a single latch allowed the barrel and cylinder to fold open like a book. A star extractor rose automatically, pushing all the spent cartridge cases out simultaneously. The cylinder was completely empty and ready for reloading in under 2 seconds. Smith & Wesson had already patented specific top break geometries, successfully selling theirs to the premium market for $18 to $22. H&R, staying true to their model, engineered functional variations and reached the market at a shocking $6 to $9. The functional difference for a regular buyer needing a reliable sidearm was simply not worth the massive price gap. H&R aggressively moved their products through hardware stores, booming mail-order catalogs like Sears, Roebuck, and institutional sales to small-town police departments and railway security teams. By the turn of the century, Harrington and Richardson was producing an estimated 100,000 revolvers per year, making it one of the 3 largest revolver manufacturers in America by sheer volume. The 20th century arrived not as a disruption, but as an acceleration. The product line steadily expanded into simple single-shot pistols, hammerless pocket revolvers for concealed carry, and rugged break-action shotguns for hunters. H&R's commercial logic remained identical to the day they were founded. Identify a basic functional requirement. Engineer the simplest, reliable mechanism possible. Produce it at an unbeatable price, and distribute it widely. This created a quiet, incredibly durable brand loyalty. Buyers bought H&R because it worked, it was affordable, and they saw absolutely no reason to pay a premium for a fancy nameplate. Then came the storm of August 1914. When the United States finally entered the First World War in 1917, the commercial market paused, and H&R shifted entirely to military production. Their role was critical: to produce precision components, specifically receiver forgings and trigger groups, for the Enfield Pattern 1917 rifle, which would become the primary American infantry rifle of the war. H&R held its tolerances flawlessly. They proved they could run with the biggest names in the military-industrial complex. If you're fascinated by the engineering logic and market strategies that drive these historic arms factories, hit the like button and leave a comment telling us which historic brand or specific firearm you want us to cover next. Your suggestions drive the content on this channel. After the armistice in 1918, H&R comfortably returned to commercial production. Highly conservative management kept the company virtually debt-free. This financial restraint is what allowed them to easily survive the Great Depression in the 1930s, a time when banks aggressively called in loans and crushed dozens of competitors. Then came December 1941. Within just 60 days of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the sprawling Park Avenue factory converted completely back to wartime production. The War Department, remembering their flawless work in 1917, assigned H&R 3 simultaneous and vital contracts. First, they were subcontracting precision components for the M1 Garand, the legendary semi-automatic service rifle that would win the war. Second, they produced rugged 12-gauge pump-action shotguns specifically for military police and guard duty. The third contract, however, is the one history has not been kind to: the infamous Rising Model 50 submachine gun. The U.S. Marine Corps and Navy desperately needed a .45 ACP submachine gun. The famous Thompson was beautifully made, but it was incredibly heavy and ruinously expensive to produce. Eugene Rising's Model 50 was lighter, cheaper, and theoretically easier to mass manufacture. H&R was awarded the sole manufacturing contract, ultimately producing approximately 100,000 units. On the factory floor and the testing range, the Rising performed beautifully. H&R's machining was so superb that they even won the highly prestigious Army-Navy Award for Excellence in Wartime Production. But then, the Marines actually took the Rising to the brutal shores of Guadalcanal in August 1942. In conditions of extreme equatorial heat, torrential rainfall, and gritty volcanic mud, the Rising failed catastrophically. The exact tight tolerances that made the weapon function flawlessly in a clean Worcester machine shop caused it to bind and jam almost instantly in contaminated field conditions. Marines facing terrifying nighttime infiltration attacks found themselves holding jammed, useless weapons. The USMC quietly withdrew the Rising from frontline combat service in 1943, relegating it to stateside guard duty. H&R had built exactly what they were contracted to build, to the exact blueprints and specifications provided, but the design itself was fundamentally intolerant of actual combat environments. After World War II, H&R returned once again to its core competency, commercial production. In 1948, they introduced what would become a legend: the Model 999 Sportsman, a 9-shot top-break revolver chambered in .22 long rifle. It was incredibly accurate, fiercely reliable, and even featured a hand-adjusted trigger. The Model 999 was a masterpiece of budget engineering. It remained in continuous production for an astonishing 38 years, practically defining the company's post-war identity and keeping the lights on in Worcester. Do you have any personal experience with classic H&R firearms like the Model 999 or their single-shot shotguns? Drop a comment and share your story with the community. We love reading about these pieces of history still being used today. By 1960, H&R offered over 40 distinct models in their catalog. But if you looked closely, they were almost all variations of the exact same mechanical vocabulary developed in the 1890s. Simple break-action single shots and top-break revolvers. There was no modern semi-automatic pistol in their lineup. There was no original centerfire repeating rifle. There was no attempt to enter the rapidly modernizing law enforcement duty weapon market. The restraint from management was total, highly conscious, and for a long time, commercially defensible. They owned the budget market, and they refused to spend money chasing anything else. Then came the legislative earthquake of 1968. The Gun Control Act of 1968 prohibited interstate mail-order sales of firearms, instantly cutting off the massive Sears Roebuck catalog channel that H&R had relied on for decades. It also banned the importation of ultra-cheap foreign pocket revolvers. At first glance, this eliminated the so-called Saturday night specials, which should have helped H&R. But instead, it opened the door for aggressive mid-tier European and South American manufacturers like Beretta and Taurus to flood the American market. By 1972, imported, modern Taurus revolvers were selling for $45 to $65. H&R's equivalent, built on aging machinery with high union labor costs in Massachusetts, was suddenly priced at $55 to $70. For the very first time in over 100 years, Harrington Richardson was no longer the cheapest option on the shelf. It was now a mid-priced option in a fiercely competitive market, but it had never spent a single dollar building a premium brand story to justify that higher price. At the exact same time, the American law enforcement and civilian defensive markets were rapidly transitioning away from revolvers and toward high-capacity, semi-automatic pistols. Colt had the venerable 1911, and Smith & Wesson was innovating rapidly with their Wonder 9s. H&R had absolutely no semi-automatic pistol to offer. They had the engineering capability and the floor space, but their ultra-conservative management had stubbornly refused to commit capital to research and development. They were trapped in their legacy designs. The revenue base began rapidly narrowing from all sides. Foreign competition ruthlessly undercut them on price. Premium American brands dominated the lucrative law enforcement and military contracts. The volume mail-order channel was permanently dead. The numbers told a grim story. By 1975, the Worcester workforce fell from a peak of 1,600 down to 1,000. By 1980, it was 950. In 1982, a devastating fire damaged a major section of the Park Avenue factory, and management simply never fully rebuilt it. By 1985, annual sales fell below 200,000 units for the first time since the darkest days of the 1930s. The margins were entirely gone. The company was bleeding cash. If you value these deep, unvarnished dives into the history of the world's most significant firearms manufacturers, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. We bring you the definitive, highly researched stories of industrial titans, mechanical innovation, and the brutal realities of the free market every single week. In January 1986, the quiet, internal decision was finally made. The massive factory closed its doors forever. The historic name Harrington Richardson was eventually sold off like scrap. It was briefly resurrected in 1987 by a group of former employees in Gardner, Massachusetts, desperately trying to maintain the same legacy product lines, before ultimately being absorbed into the Marlin Firearms orbit, then swallowed by the Remington Outdoor Company, and finally landing as a subsidiary under Vista Outdoor. Today, pre-1986 Worcester-produced H&R revolvers command surprising premium prices at auction. Competitive rimfire shooters and collectors recognize the incredibly tight cylinder gaps and hand-fitted craftsmanship that defined the original factory floor. Even the infamous deeply flawed Rising Model 50 commands thousands of dollars from dedicated World War II historical collectors. Gilbert Harrington was never truly a gunmaker who happened to know machinery. He was, from his first day to his last, a machinist who happened to make guns. That subtle but profound difference is the entire explanation for what H&R built, and ultimately, what it completely failed to become. What the city of Worcester lost in 1986 was not just 850 well-paying manufacturing jobs. It was a specific, entirely irreplaceable form of institutional knowledge. It was the accumulated craft of generations of machinists who knew exactly how to hold perfect, aerospace-level tolerances on firearms that sold for less than a week's groceries. For 113 incredible years, being affordable and wildly reliable was H&R's entire strategy, its impenetrable moat, and its only answer to every single question the market ever asked. But when the world fundamentally changed, and the modern market asked a completely different question, Harrington and Richardson looked at their ledgers, looked at their aging machines, and had absolutely no other answer to give. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.